November 1944. Japan was experiencing a period of tension and imminent collapse. After its devastating defeat at the Battle of Midway 2 years earlier, the Imperial Navy had lost 4 of its most important aircraft carriers in a single day. The blow was not only military but symbolic. The country that dominated the Pacific was now struggling to maintain control over its own waters. The response of the Japanese admirals came in the form of an ambitious project, the Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built. The Shinano began its life as a Yamato-class battleship, the same class that had given rise to the heaviest ships in history. However, with the tide of war turning and the growing importance of naval aviation, Japanese engineers were ordered to convert the hull into a new type of ship, an armored aircraft carrier capable of carrying aircraft, fuel, and repair equipment for an entire fleet. The project was treated with the utmost secrecy. The vessel would be a floating fortress, a mobile base of operations designed to restore Japanese naval supremacy. With a displacement of 70,000 tons and a length of 872 feet, the Shinano surpassed any American aircraft carrier. Its armor was thicker than any other ship in its class. Engineers claimed it could withstand a dozen torpedoes without sinking. Every inch of steel symbolized the admiral's confidence in Japanese engineering and their belief that size and protection would still decide battles. But this confidence masked a dangerous rush. By the end of 1944, Japan's situation had deteriorated dramatically. Factories were running out of fuel, supply lines had been cut, and American bombers were already attacking the homeland almost daily. Still, the Shinano was seen as a symbol that could not fail. Even unfinished, it had to set sail as soon as possible, before air raids destroyed it while still in the shipyard. Construction work took place in absolute secrecy at the port of Yokosuka. Teams of welders worked day and night under camouflaged lights, while the metallic sound of tools echoed throughout the shipyard. The ship still smelled of fresh paint and newly cut steel when its departure date was set. Essential tests, checks, and equipment were still missing. Many of the internal systems, such as sewage pumps and communications between compartments, were not yet operational. The watertight doors, essential for containing flooding in the event of an attack, had been installed only a few days earlier, and few had been tested. Even with all these problems, the order was clear and non-negotiable. The Shinano had to leave immediately. The authorities feared that American planes would locate the ship in the shipyard and destroy it before it could even move. So in the late afternoon of November 28, 1944, the Shinano quietly left the port of Yokosuka. Twilight concealed the immense steel silhouette as it slowly glided out to the open sea. Its mission was simple, but risky: to sail to the port of Kure, where the ship would be completed and receive its squadron of aircraft. There were just over 2,400 people on board, but only a third of them were properly trained sailors. The rest were recruits, engineers, and civilian workers who were still working on the ship's unfinished systems. 3 destroyers, the Isokaze, the Hamakaze, and the Yukikaze, escorted the aircraft carrier. They sailed in an irregular formation, without effective coordination. Communications between the ships were unstable, and few believed that the enemy could be so close to the Japanese coast. It was a false sense of security. The sea was calm, and the crew believed that the trip to Kure would be quick and uneventful. The ship, however, was vulnerable. Even with its impressive armor, the Shinano was far from ready for combat. It did not have complete armament, its electrical system was unstable, and the exhaust pumps had barely been calibrated. The vessel that the admirals considered indestructible could barely perform a sharp maneuver without compromising its structure. At that moment, none of the men on board could have imagined that the Shinano's fate would be decided in a few hours. It was believed that the Japanese coast was still safe, that American submarines were much further south, but the sea no longer belonged to Japan. American patrols had become increasingly bold, and submarines continuously hunted enemy ships even in the vicinity of Tokyo. Across the ocean, one of these submarines was silently patrolling, the USS Archerfish, under the command of Lieutenant Joseph Enright. He and his crew were patrolling the southern part of Tokyo Bay that same night. At 8 p.m., the Archerfish's radar operator picked up a distant, large, and fast echo. It looked like an isolated formation, not a convoy. Enright, curious, rose to periscope depth and saw for the first time a colossal shadow cutting across the horizon in the dim moonlight. The commander did not know what he was looking at. The silhouette was too large for any known Japanese cruiser. The escort destroyers moved in a zigzag pattern, indicating the presence of something valuable in the center. The radar and onboard chronometer began to record the course, speed, and frequency of direction changes. The target was traveling at about 20 knots, an unusual speed for transport vessel. Enright reported the contact to command but received no instruction. He then decided to take the initiative, to continue the pursuit throughout the night. The American submarine adjusted its course to follow the same line as the enemy giant. Inside the control compartment, the air was heavy and hot. The crew remained absolutely silent while the commander, from time to time, raised the periscope just enough to observe the target's course. For hours, the USS Archerfish remained parallel to the Shinano's route. The American crew did not know the name of the ship they were following, nor its importance, but they knew they were facing one of the biggest targets they had ever seen. And while the sea remained calm and the sky cloudy, the fate of the world's largest aircraft carrier was inevitably approaching. The Shinano's voyage, which had begun as an attempt to protect the ultimate symbol of Japanese power, was about to become one of the shortest and most tragic stories in naval history. In less than 24 hours, that steel colossus would cease to be the pride of the admiral and become the largest shipwreck ever caused by a submarine. And it would all begin with unshakable confidence in its own armor. The sea was calm when the USS Archerfish began its silent pursuit. Commander Joseph Enright watched closely every radar reading, every distant echo that appeared and disappeared on the monitor. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, a different signal caught his attention. It was large, steady, and moving quickly. The behavior was atypical. It was not a convoy, nor was it an isolated transport. The Japanese vessel was zigzagging at a speed of over 20 knots. To an experienced commander, this could only mean one thing: a high-value target. Enright brought the submarine to periscope depth and slowly turned the instrument. In the distance, under the faint moonlight, a gigantic shadow cut across the horizon. The hull was too long for a cruiser and too tall for a tanker. Nothing similar had been reported in that region. He recorded the coordinates, but received no further instructions from command. The decision was his. He chose to follow the contact throughout the night, keeping the radar silent and the engines at minimum speed so as not to be detected. Inside the submarine, the atmosphere was tense. The thin air and heat from the engines made each minute feel heavier. The crew spoke in whispers, awaiting orders. The clock marked the slow passage of hours as the Archerfish copied the movements of the Japanese giant. Every turn, every deceleration was timed with precision. Enright knew he needed to understand the navigation pattern before closing in for the attack. On the upper deck, the Shinano advanced imposingly. With 3 escort destroyers, Isokaze, Hamikaze, and Yukikaze, the newly launched ship maintained a steady speed. Captain Toshio Abe believed that the distance from the coast and the cover of darkness were sufficient protection. No enemy submarine would dare to operate so close to Japanese territory, he thought. Under his orders, the crew continued with finishing work, cables being secured, pipes tested, electrical equipment adjusted. The ship was still a floating construction site. Meanwhile, the Archerfish adjusted its course. The sonar detected the heavy sound of the aircraft carrier's propellers and the lighter noise of the destroyers accompanying it. Enright kept the course parallel, avoiding premature approach. Depth readings indicated that the best chance for attack would be when the target made a predictable turn. He waited patiently. Discipline and silence were his greatest weapons. At midnight, the submarine slowed down even further. Enright and the navigation officer drew a manual movement map on the calculation table. Every variation in the Shinano's course was noted with split-second precision. The enemy vessel seemed to follow a defensive pattern: 20 minutes in a straight line, then a slight turn to the left, maintaining a speed of 20 knots. It repeated the cycle. The commander realized that all he had to do was wait for the moment when the aircraft carrier completed another maneuver to expose its side. Inside the Shinano, few knew they were being followed. The escort destroyers scanned the surface with old sonar that was ineffective against submarines at great depths. Captain Abe had complete confidence in the ship's armor and robustness. Even if they were attacked, he believed, the damage would be superficial. The civilian crew worked tirelessly. The corridors still smelled of oil and fresh paint. The immense structure vibrated with each impulse of the propellers, producing a low, continuous sound that spread throughout the hull. At 2:30 a.m., the Archerfish adjusted its depth to 45 meters. The periscope emerged for the last time. On the horizon, the silhouette of the Shinano appeared sideways, outlined by the faint light of the moon. Enright realized that this was the right moment. He ordered the submarine to increase speed and position itself ahead of the target's route. The torpedoes were prepared, and the firing angles calculated manually. At 3 a.m, the submarine completed the maneuver. Inside the torpedo compartment, the men waited in silence. The commander made the final depth adjustment and took a deep breath. "Ready to fire," reported the first mate. Enright looked at the chronometer, measured the estimated distance, and gave the order. Tubes 1 through 6, fire. 6 Mark 14. Torpedoes left the Archerfish's tubes with a sharp sound, disappearing into the dark waters. 45 seconds later, 4 deep detonations shook the ocean. The vibration ran through the submarine's hull. The lights flickered, and for a moment no one spoke. Immediately after the impact, Enright ordered an emergency dive to avoid a possible counterattack. The Archerfish quickly sank to a depth of over 100 meters. Above, the Shinano had been hit. The torpedoes exploded below the waterline on the starboard side, hitting 3 main compartments and one of the boiler rooms. The force of the explosions tore several meter-long gashes in the hull. The impact caused the ship to shake violently, throwing sailors to the floor. The lights flickered, and for a few minutes the ship was plunged into partial darkness. In the lower corridors, water began to flood the compartment. The newly installed watertight doors did not seal properly. Emergency crews tried to start the drainage pumps, but the systems failed one after another. Orders were relayed by messenger, as many internal telephone lines were inoperative. The metallic clang of tools and the rising sound of water echoed through the lower levels. Captain Abe gathered the officers on the bridge and assessed the situation. The initial report indicated serious but controllable damage. He believed the armored structure would hold and ordered maximum speed toward shore. The decision, however, would have fatal consequences. As speed increased, the water pressure on the cracks grew, accelerating the flooding of the damaged compartment. Meanwhile, the Archerfish remained in absolute silence. No enemy response came. No destroyer sonar was searching for them. The American sailors heard only the distant sound of secondary explosions reverberating through the water. Enright did not know what he had hit, but he was sure the target was huge. The attack had been executed with precision and discipline, the culmination of hours of meticulous observation. Around 4 a.m., the submarine began its withdrawal maneuver. The radio team recorded the exact time of the attack and sent the preliminary report. The commander remained silent for several long minutes before writing in his logbook. 4 explosions confirmed. Large target. No pursuit detected. The sea surface returned to calm. There were no visible signs of battle, only the distant echo of a colossus beginning to fight against its own structure. In the hours that followed, the Shinano, the pride of the Imperial Navy, would face the test that its creators believed impossible to fail. And while the ship tried to resist deep in the Pacific, the Archerfish continued on its course, leaving behind an attack that would soon become part of naval history. And if you want to follow other real stories that marked World War II, sign up so you don't miss the next episodes. On board the Shinano, the confusion began seconds after the explosion. The muffled sound of the torpedoes reverberated throughout the hull, followed by a violent tremor that knocked down men, tools, and equipment. Lights flickered and went out for a few moments. The crew was still trying to understand what had happened when the first reports began to reach the bridge. Several lower compartments were flooding. The explosions had struck the starboard side of the ship, below the armor belt, a vulnerable area where the protection was thinner. 3 boiler rooms and fuel tanks began to fill rapidly with seawater. Emergency alarms sounded throughout the vessel. Damage control teams rushed to the affected areas, but found a critical situation. The newly installed watertight doors did not seal properly. Some were bent, others did not close completely. Several internal telephone lines were out of service, and communication between decks now depended on messengers. The Shinano, which was supposed to be a technological fortress, was functioning precariously. Captain Toshio Abe, experienced and respected, remained calm. His first instinct was to believe in the ship's resilience. He ordered the damaged compartments to be checked and the internal barriers reinforced. Engineers attempted to start the electric pumps to contain the flooding, but they failed almost immediately due to short-circuiting caused by salt water. It was then necessary to resort to manual pumps, operated by dozens of sailors in exhausting shifts. Meanwhile, the ship began to list slightly to starboard. The clock read 3:30 a.m. Initial measurements indicated a tilt of approximately 5 degrees. It was still slight, but it was slowly increasing. Orders to maintain course toward the coast were reinforced. The captain believed that if he could reach shallow waters, he could run the ship aground and avoid total loss. The decision, however, aggravated the problem. The increase in speed caused the water pressure in the cracks to intensify. The flow through the holes in the hull doubled, flooding adjacent compartments. The damage control crew improvised with what they had: mattresses, pieces of wood, tarpaulins, and even metal tools to seal cracks. The heat and the smell of fuel mixed with seawater made the environment almost unbearable. In the boiler rooms, the water began to extinguish the furnaces. The steam generated by the flooded boilers turned the lower corridors into a hot and suffocating fog. Many crew members were rushed out due to lack of oxygen. Communication with the bridge became increasingly difficult. The crew was scattered between areas without power and partially submerged corridors. At 4:30 a.m., the ship was already listing at 10 degrees. Still, Captain Abe maintained the order to press on. He believed that the massive structure and heavy armor would hold. The escort destroyers followed at a distance, unable to get too close due to the darkness and the risk of collision. None of them knew the true extent of the damage. At 5 a.m., the Shinano slowed down for the first time. The force of the propellers began to cause dangerous vibrations in weakened areas. The bridge received reports of failures in the auxiliary generators and new leaks in the fuel tanks. The smell of oil spread throughout the lower deck. Some compartments began to lose support and give way under the weight of the accumulated water. Dawn revealed the gravity of the situation. The sun had barely risen when the aircraft carrier was listing at 15 degrees. Waves crashed against the side deck, and water was already reaching some of the hatches. Exhausted crews tried to pump the seawater back out, but the electrical system kept failing. At 6:30 a.m., the flood alarm sounded again. The central compartments were also compromised. The sailors began to evacuate the lower levels. Many climbed steep and slippery stairs, carrying equipment and wounded personnel. On the flight deck, hundreds of men awaited instructions. The ship was still moving slowly, but the force of the sea and the weight of the accumulated water reduced its speed with every passing minute. Captain Abe gathered the senior officers and received the final report. The main pumps were inoperative, and the electrical power was already unstable. Even so, he refused to abandon ship. The order was to attempt to tow the ship. The destroyers Isokaze and Yukikaze launched steel cables and began to pull the Shinano toward the coast, but the maneuver failed. The tension on the cables was so great that one of them broke a few minutes later, almost hitting the crew. The destroyers moved away, maintaining a safe position. At 8:30 a.m., the aircraft carrier was practically motionless. The list gradually increased to 20 degrees. Water had flooded storage areas, workshops, and dormitories. The corridors were a submerged labyrinth. Part of the civilian crew, with no experience in naval emergencies, panicked. Many began jumping into the sea on their own, ignoring orders from the bridge. At 9 a.m., the main generators failed completely. The ship plunged into partial darkness. The bridge continued to operate with flashlights and backup batteries. Captain Abe still believed he could save the ship. He ordered the redistribution of weights and an attempt to level the hull, but it was too late. The internal displacement of water made stability impossible. At 10 a.m., the Shinano was listing more than 30 degrees. Sailors clung to structures, trying not to slip on the wet deck. The metallic clang of falling objects mingled with the sound of waves crashing against the hull. Captain Abe, seeing that the situation was out of control, finally authorized evacuation. The warning, "All hands, abandon ship," echoed through the loudspeakers. Chaos took over the deck. Men threw themselves into the sea, many without life jackets. The escort destroyers began rescue operations, but the number of survivors was uncertain. At 10:57 a.m., the Shinano tilted completely. Its gigantic hull slowly turned, the bow pointing skyward before disappearing beneath the surface. The sea closed over it in a matter of seconds. The largest aircraft carrier ever built had sunk after only 17 hours of sailing. Of the approximately 2,400 men on board, just over 1,000 survived. Captain Toshio Abe remained on the bridge until the end, last seen as the ship capsized. Destroyers collected survivors throughout the day, while debris and oil slicks spread across the surface. As silence returned to the sea, radio signals ceased completely. The colossus that was supposed to represent the power and resilience of the Imperial Navy had disappeared without ever having participated in a single battle. The rescue operation would continue for hours, but the reality was already clear. The Shinano was lost. In Tokyo, the first news arrived late and confused. Communications with the Shinano had ceased completely, and only fragmented messages from the escort destroyers indicated the gravity of the situation. When it was finally confirmed that Japan's largest aircraft carrier had sunk, the reaction within the Naval High Command was one of disbelief. None of the admirals believed that a vessel of that magnitude could be lost after only 17 hours of sailing. Initial reports mentioned a possible submarine attack, but many officers considered the hypothesis unlikely. The idea that 4 torpedoes had been enough to destroy a 70,000-ton fortress seemed impossible. The command ordered absolute secrecy. No information was to be disclosed to the press, and survivors were warned not to comment on what had happened, under threat of imprisonment. The disaster was seen as a matter of national honor. The Shinano represented Japanese industrial and military power, and admitting its loss would be to acknowledge that confidence in engineering and armor had failed. The ship's official record was kept secret until the end of the war. Even among the sailors of the Imperial Navy itself, few knew of the aircraft carrier's existence during the conflict. While Japan tried to cover up the tragedy, on the other side of the Pacific, the USS Archerfish sailed back to base. Commander Joseph Enright and his crew reported the attack in detail. They reported the coordinates, the time of the firing, and the number of torpedoes used. However, American analysts doubted the report. It was believed that no Japanese aircraft carrier of that size existed. Estimates indicated that the target must have been a large cruiser. Enright himself did not know the name of the ship he had attacked. Only after the end of the war, with access to Japanese naval archives, was it possible to confirm the feat. The Archerfish had sunk the Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built. Official recognition came months later. Enright received the Navy Cross, and the crew of the Archerfish was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation. The attack came to be considered one of the greatest individual actions by a submarine in the entire Second World War. The impact of the episode was more than symbolic. It demonstrated the vulnerability of large ships in the new era of submarine and air warfare. The wreckage of the Shinano remained at the bottom of the sea, about 200 kilometers off the Japanese coast. No rescue operation was attempted during the conflict. The Imperial Navy's priority was to maintain silence and prevent the enemy from learning of what had happened. Only decades later would independent research confirm the coordinates of the wreck, based on the Archerfish's records and the testimonies of survivors. The few who escaped recounted the final hours with military precision. Many said the ship began to list slowly before dawn, and that orders to abandon ship came too late. Several civilian sailors, untrained in combat, were unable to find escape routes in the flooded corridors. Others jumped into the sea without life jackets. Of the approximately 2,400 men on board, just over 1,080 were rescued by destroyers. Captain Toshio Abe, last seen on the bridge, disappeared with the ship. The internal impact on the Japanese naval hierarchy was immediate. Military investigations found serious flaws in the ship's construction, the rush to launch it, and the crew's preparation. The sealing systems and drainage pumps had been installed hastily, and many civilian workers boarded the ship without emergency training. Even so, the findings of the inquiry were kept secret. No official documents on the sinking were released until Japan's surrender in 1945. After the war, the United States examined the Shinano's reports and construction diagrams. Naval engineers were surprised by the level of armor, but they also identified critical design flaws. The conversion of a battleship into an aircraft carrier had compromised the structural integrity of the hull. The internal bulkheads were not designed to withstand lateral flooding caused by multiple impacts. When the Archerfish's torpedoes struck below the protective line, water quickly spread between compartments, eliminating any chance of recovery. The sinking of the Shinano marked the definitive decline of the era of large battleships and armored aircraft carriers. From that point on, naval warfare would increasingly rely on mobility, carrier-based aviation, and submarine warfare. The episode became a classic example studied in military academies, mainly because of the combination of human and technical factors that led to the disaster. For Japan, the loss of the Shinano symbolized the exhaustion of its industrial and logistical capacity. It was the last major project of the imperial fleet, Built at a time when the country was already lacking resources and fuel, its sinking, even before entering combat, ended the era of large Japanese warships. Today, surviving records tell a story of chain failures, hasty decisions, overconfidence in armor, and a lack of adequate testing. The aircraft carrier that was supposed to represent the rebirth of Japanese naval power ended its days without launching a single plane. The Archerfish attack, executed with precision and patience, went down in history as the largest ship ever sunk by a submarine. What could have been different in this story? Would the Shinano have survived if it had waited longer in the shipyard? Or was the outcome inevitable in the face of advancing submarine warfare? Leave your comment with your opinion on this decisive event in naval history. If you enjoyed this content, like the video, share it with anyone interested in military history, and subscribe to the channel to follow other real stories from World War II.